All right, so about a week ago, I released a tier list talking about what I thought the meta DPS were going to be for Mythic Plus and kind of how things were shaping up so far with the PTR. Since then, Blizzard did pretty large class tuning, and I think now is probably the time to kind of talk about where we're predicting things to be again in terms of tier listing specializations. This is going to be the last one I'm going to be doing. I do maintain the Wowhead Mythic Plus DPS tier list, so if you want something in the future or you're looking at things where they shape up after like 3 or 4 weeks, I am going to be continuing to update that one. This one is going to be more predictive based on what we're seeing this season so far. Now, what I will say is I think there's still likely to be class tuning that's going to be taking effect. I do think that there are some specs that are still a little bit too strong, particularly aimed at raid. And there's still some specs that are particularly a little bit too weak. Again, more so aimed at raid than Mythic Plus. And I kind of expect Blizzard to continue to tune stuff. We are coming off the back of one of the best tuned seasons in Mythic Plus and World of Warcraft history. I would love to see that to stay. Now, let's kind of talk about what these tiers mean. So first and foremost, S tier, this is one of them is required for every single composition. Historically, War Within Season 1 enhancement, Shaman kind of fits this mold. The Dragonflight Season 3 EVOKER kind of fits this mold. Dragonflight Season 2 EVOKER fits this mold, where these are specializations that, they're more or less required whenever you're looking to play. A tier, these are specializations that kind of fit into a really good Mythic Plus composition. Sometimes they don't necessarily fit with all of the other stuff that are in A tier, but individually they're really good specializations, and they will make up a large portion of the metagame. B tier, these are typically good third DPS options. They bring some things to the table. They tend to do pretty good DPS. There's probably some weaknesses there, and we'll talk about those weaknesses. And then C tier, these are specs with a little bit more weaknesses. They tend to be a little bit behind the curve in terms of what damage they're providing, or maybe their damage profile is not very good. Maybe they don't bring buffs at all, stuff like that. There tend to be like multiple pretty defined weaknesses. And then D tier, this is the spec where you should be like potentially looking to reroll. The spec is horrible. Yeah, but in general, most of it ends up being based around how much DPS a lot of these specializations can do. Because this is a Mythic Plus DPS tier list. It really kind of depends on like overall DPS. That is probably the most important metric. Let me add a row below this one. Let me put this as A-, because I actually think that this season is not too bad. Oh, this is A-. Because I actually don't think the season is necessarily going to be too bad. I think that a lot of specs are going to be kind of close starting out. But I don't think that they're going to be. I do still think we're due for a little bit more tuning to try to continue to narrow that gap between the absolute top and the absolute bottom. So let's kind of go through and talk about why I'm ranking specs where I'm ranking them. First and foremost, we have Affliction Warlock. I'm going to slam this up in A- tier. I think this is a specialization that does pretty good priority damage and fairly solid AoE. This is a spec that can spiral a little bit due to Vile Taint and, dot uptimes and stuff like that. I know some people aren't exactly thrilled with the play style of how Affliction plays currently, but I actually do think that overall DPS-wise and the things that the Affliction Warlock actually does and contributes in Mythic Plus, I actually think the specialization is fairly solid. I have it as the top performing Warlock specialization right now. You'll see where the other Warlock specs are in just a couple of seconds, but I do have it as the top performing one. So let's kind of talk about where these other Warlock specs are. I'm going to be putting Destro and Demo both in A- as well with Affliction. Now, this is kind of interesting because I think that Demo is one of the more likely specializations to receive nerfs. Now, the reason that I say that is because they are projected to perform above average, like really strong in raid, and they're simming super high. They're not as good in Mythic Plus. Their damage is like fine. They're worse than Affliction and worse than Destro. They have good single target damage though, but I'm really worried about them getting nerfed, and so then they would move down into B. As it currently stands though, I have them in A-. Destro, this spec is really good. So most people are going to be playing Hellcaller. I have seen some stuff where people are messing around with Diabolus, Destro, and Mythic Plus. This is mostly a dungeon pool thing. Halls of Atonement, Priority Sacred Flame, Gambit, all really large uncapped AoE pulls. And Destro, that's kind of where Hellcaller Destro really begins to excel. In situations where they need to do a little bit more single target damage, I think they're a little bit worse off. And so I kind of have all three Warlock specs in this A- tier, where really good third DPS options, pretty good second DPS options. Depending on how the metagame evolves, they could occupy a little bit of a higher share of metagame performance. All right, let's go ahead and talk about Mage, another cloth-wearing DPS. I currently have Arcane in A tier. I think that this is one of the best specs on this patch. Similar reasons that it was good in last season, Dragonflight Season 2, or Dragonflight War Within Season 2. Resonance and their priority damage and their funnel damage is pretty unmatched in terms of just how much damage they're able to provide. Their damage during Arcane Surge is quite strong. You ended up playing around them a lot in Season 2, and I would be surprised to see anything change in that regard. Now, they want a bunch of trash bombs on top of single target bosses, and they're able to kind of take control over the dungeon if you do pull around their cooldowns. I think Arcane is just exceptionally strong DPS. They also bring things like Mass Barrier, which has a 15% DR because of how Arcane Barrier ends up functioning. They also have things like, 5 individual defensives with their own personal barrier, mirror images, invis, whatever else they have, ice block. So mages are, defensively very, very powerful. They also increase the group survivability by a decent amount. We have Fire and Frost. So Fire did end up getting nerfed actually pretty significantly in this patch, where all their damage ended up getting reduced by 3%. Their Flame Strike damage ended up getting reduced by 15%. I think this is pushing this down towards the B tier. I think this was previously a specialization that we had a little bit higher. I think their damage is a little bit lackluster. They're currently on a Flame Strike build. I think in general, you want, whenever you're thinking about Fire historically, you want them to be playing more towards Ignite and less towards Flame Strike is a large contributing factor of their AoE damage, just because then that allows them to be able to do good priority damage as opposed to being forced to do this patty AoE. For Frost Mage, I'm putting them in A- tier. I think they're definitely better damage-wise than Fire. They also have priority damage, whereas Fire doesn't. I think if there's a world where Arcane ends up catching a significant enough nerf, I think Frost could actually slot into that spot that Arcane occupies. Not necessarily an A tier, but the compositions that are playing around the Arcane Mage, I think they could instead play with a Frost Mage occupying a similar vein where, love Arcane Intellect. Mage just fills most niches pretty solid, but of course the Wizard comps work more optimally for Mage comps, generally speaking. Okay, next up we got DPS Warrior. DPS Warrior, historically garbage. I don't think we've ever actually seen a season where DPS Warrior has occupied a large position in the broader metagame for Mythic Plus, and this season's going to be no different. I'm going to be putting Fury in B tier, and I'm going to be putting Arms in C. I think Arms is downright diabolically bad. I think this spec sucks. I think you can make an argument that it's maybe supposed to go D tier. I don't think it's very good. Damage contribution-wise, it's just not very solid. It was okay in last season. Wasn't the greatest, but it was okay in last season. We saw some full off meta compositions that were playing a lot of Fizz stuff. Getting value out of Battle Shout and Arms was one of the, obviously they're the Battle Shout bringer. Fury this season seems like they're doing a little bit better at DPS than Arms, and if you're going to be playing a full Fizz comp, something that plays around a Brewmaster Monk, maybe like a Resto Shaman in your group as well, I think that Fury Warrior is a specialization that is more likely to be played from the DPS Warrior perspective. The obvious upsides is that they have Battle Shout. 5% attack power for all physical damage dealers is very valuable. It's a lot better than, let's say, Mystic Touch. But I think that there's a world where you would be playing this DPS Warrior with a Brewmaster Monk, and that makes sense. Now, I will say one of the downsides of Warrior is that Protection Warrior seems like they're also fairly solid. So if you're, you really want that Battle Shout, you can always get it from Prot, which there has to be some consideration taken into effect whenever you're thinking about like broader meta compositional building. All right, next up, we got Rogue. So we have Assassination, Outlaw, and Subtlety. And all 3 specs of Rogue have actually gotten buffed recently. And this is a situation where I think a lot of people are stonks on Rogue. Just in general, I think that Assassination is one of the best specs in the game in terms of their priority damage. They're able to spread their bleeds. They're able to put Rupture on a bunch of targets. And then they're able to get a lot of energy regen out of that and then continue to convert that into priority damage. So they don't have funnel damage like Arcane Mage does, where Arcane Mage converts all of their AoE damage into more single target damage. Assassination maybe has a little bit of that, maybe like funnel, or maybe like funnel minus. Definitely not as good as Arcane Mage, definitely not as good as like Havoc Demon Hunter in that regard. But Assassination is still excellent in that way. And I think that this enables a lot more of the melee-centric play around Battle Shout compositions. Now, I will say one of the downsides of our Assassination Rogue is they really don't want to play with like something like an Arcane Mage or Havoc Demon Hunter, because it kind of occupies the same niche. And so that kind of creates this weird situation where we have two of the specs in one of our higher tiers that can't really play together. So you're going to be kind of searching for compositions that I think make a little bit more sense. I think it's going to be a little bit tougher to try to figure out where those compositions make sense. I'm going to slam Outlaw in A-. I think if there's a full physical comp that kind of starts to see a bunch of play that involves a Mystic Touch, I do think there's some situations where Outlaw can maybe beat out Assassination. I do think there's damage different, like the way that these specializations do damage is a little bit different. I don't think it's like a 1-to-1 replacement, but I do think that Outlaw is still quite potent, particularly whenever you're looking at like Fizz comp with, again, Brewmaster, Monk, Warrior buff somehow. Yeah, if you get like a Feral Druid and then you end up getting Shaman buff in there as well, I think that Outlaw absolutely can outpace Assassination due to the stacking nature of raid buffs, especially in a season where damage ends up, if it ends up being close, raid buffs are more impactful. And so I think that Outlaw can occupy a third DPS slot in A- and maybe be better than Assassination in some capacity. Sub, I'm going to be slamming this in B. I actually don't think Sub is bad. I think Sub is just worse than Outlaw and Assassination in most situations. Sub's advantage over Outlaw and Assassination is I think it does just better single target damage than both of these specializations, and it's hard to get single target damage in Mythic Plus, but I think that the amount of DPS that it does is just a little bit worse than where we see from Assassination and Outlaw, to where I'm just going to slam this in B. Next up, we got DPS Druid. I'm going to be putting Feral in B, and I'm going to be putting Balance in C. Now, I'm going to say this. Mark of the Wild is one of the most broken raid buffs in existence. Mark of the Wild is generally hailed as the best raid buff. Now, the downside of Balance and Feral right now is that Resto Druid seems to be the preferred healer. Now, there are bugs that are prevalent for Resto Druid that if they get fixed, they would hurt Resto Druid, maybe taking them out of the metagame. And then people would be looking to try to fill those niches. But we're ranking these specializations based on where they currently stand. And I think right now, Feral Druid maybe would make sense in, again, a full Fizz comp, maybe something that involves like a Protection Warrior, an Assassination Rogue, and then, say a DK, like a DPS Death Knight or something like that. I think Feral Druid could make sense in a composition that involves that, and then like a Resto Shaman healer or a Disc Priest healer. Sure, that makes sense. Probably a Resto Shaman healer, because then you want Bloodlust for that, but sure, that makes sense. For Balance right now, Balance is one of the worst DPS specs in the game. They tend to deal around 15% worse DPS than some of the other top tier options, and they don't have a great damage profile. Now, the only advantage of them, of course, is the same utility that the Feral Druid provides: double 30-second stops, Mark of the Wild. They do have Solar Beam, which is nice, but you can always play without Solar Beam. You just pull differently if you don't have it in your comp versus do have it in your comp. Now, what I will say about Balance Druid is I think it's, we talked about Demo being likely to get nerfs. I think Balance Druid is very likely to get buffed, similar with Arms Warrior, just because the speculated performance in Raid is such where I kind of expect this to go up. I don't know if it's going to end up in B, A-, where it's going to end up over the course of the entire season. But if the season launched today and we got no more changes, Balance Druid would certainly be in C tier because the damage that it provides is just not that spectacular. Okay, next up, we have DPS Hunter. Oh, we got Hunters here. We got Beast Mastery Hunter, we have Survival Hunter, we have Marksmanship. So Marksmanship was previously the best DPS on this patch. If you watched the last tier list, I had Marks up in S tier with Frost DK. Marks did end up taking a little bit of a nerf. Marks does have weaknesses. We talked about this last time, where their single target damage and their priority damage is pretty lacking. They're a pretty patty spec. As the keys do go higher, Marks' damage falls off a little bit. I do think that Marks' overall contribution to dungeons, though, just in terms of the raw DPS that they output, is still high enough to warrant an A- tier. Beast Mastery Hunter, on the other hand, they do large uncapped AoE, and I think there's some situations on like 8 to 15 targets plus where they actually do a little bit more damage than Marksmanship Hunter, and we've seen Beast Mastery, even after catching another nerf, kind of end up in a situation where Beast Mastery is still okay. I don't think that they're an absolute top tier option, but I think if you're looking for like a third DPS option for a lot of compositions, or maybe potentially Lustbringers, I think that both Marks and Beast Mastery are fairly solid. Serve, I actually think is quite good. I think, all things considered, the damage, pure DPS wise, they're probably supposed to be an A- with the other two Hunters. I think that they're unlikely to see play, though, due to the other two Hunter specializations being a lot more popular than them. And I think that that's something that you should just be looking to take into account whenever you're thinking about things like this. I think that Serve is totally fine. Damage wise, it looks pretty good. I think it's a little bit worse than maybe some of the other stuff that's an A tier, maybe a little bit worse than some of the stuff that's an A-, and those are the kind of the reasons that they're staying in B. I do think that it sucks that Hunter doesn't really have a really usable raid buff. Hunter's Mark is just garbage in Mythic Plus, frankly. And the CC isn't great. Like, we got Implosive Trap and Binding Shot, which are both pretty bad. All of this could be fixed if they just do a lot of damage, though. Like, all of this stuff doesn't really matter if they just do a lot of DPS. Next up, we got Evokers. So we got Dev and Og. And I think that Dev is going to be going into A tier, and I think that Og is going to be going down into C tier. I think that Dev is actually exceptional right now. So people like to say that Dev is very patty. That's unfortunately not true. They actually have a decent more priority damage than you would necessarily expect from the specialization, considering their reputation. Engulf and the priority damage that's available from Engulf is really solid. They did have a situation last year where they either ended up losing 10% single target damage to play for more AoE, or they lost 10% AoE to play for more single target damage. Now they have a build that is a little bit better balanced, and I think that that kind of creates a situation which is very promising for Dev. I think that Dev's biggest issue is I don't see like a very clear-cut composition. We'll talk about compositions a little bit. I don't see a very clear-cut composition that Dev just like fits really nicely into. But I don't think that that's really stopping them. Their damage is excellent. Their overall DPS is excellent. They have some of the similar tools as Augmentation Evoker, where they have Rescue Shields, they have Zephyr. So they have some of those group utility tools that the Augmentation Evoker provides. Obviously a little bit less good than that, but you know, still some good utility, just broadly speaking. Aug Evoker, this spec sucks. They nerf Scale Commander because I think they changed some of how the Guardians end up functioning. I think that the specialization just does horrible damage. Last time we talked, I'm pretty sure I said that the spec is maybe one good buff away from being back in the meta. I do not believe that we are in that situation anymore. I think you could maybe slam this down in D tier and nobody would really be too upset. I'm gonna leave this in C tier just for because I think it's about where it is. But I think that you can make a really genuine, pretty reasonable argument to put this in D tier. All right, Shamans. I'm going to be putting Ellie up in A, and I'm going to be putting Enhance down in B. So Enhance, kind of similar to Moonkin, kind of similar to Arms Warrior. This spec is projected to suck in Raid, like be awful, god-awful in Raid. I wouldn't be shocked if Enhance ends up catching a little bit of a buff. They are currently in a situation where they are good in Mythic Plus, but not the best in Mythic Plus. I would say it's really difficult to be able to get B-tier amounts of DPS out of them in Mythic Plus currently, just with how they play. It's very involved in what you have to be doing. You can't be messing up any of your Stormbringer procs. You have to always be kind of on top of your shit whenever you're playing with them. Any mistake in terms of your proc usage or anything like that, and the damage is maybe that in which it could go down to C. And I think you can make a pretty reasonable argument that they go in C. I'm gonna put them in B because I've seen some of the top performing enhancement shamans do pretty good things on it. Ellie, I put them in A. I think that Ellie's single target damage is a little bit less good than some of the other stuff that you see all the way up in A. But I think that Ellie's AoE, particularly if you're able to play around their Ascendants in some capacity, I think it can have some of the highest highs of any specialization. It's very polarizing in terms of their damage profile, and you really want to be playing around them whenever you're playing with them. But if you are able to play around them, route around them, do large trash pulls whenever that 3-minute CD is available, or potentially even 2-minute CD, depending on what they're playing, is available, I think that Ellie Shaman and Ascendants is really, really solid. Next up, we have DPS Death Knight. And a lot of people are actually pretty stonks on Unholy. I would put Unholy in A-, and I'm going to put Frost in A. Frost is kind of the similar situation what we said last time. Frost Decay, single target damage in Mythic Plus is good. Their priority damage in Mythic Plus is good. And their overall AoE DPS is fairly solid. I think that Frost Decay kind of occupies a situation where, sure, they don't have raid buff in any capacity, but grips are really valuable in Mythic Plus to be able to get the packs gathered quickly. I think that DK just in general fits nicely with a bunch of compositions. I don't think this has compositions where it's very strict in what it needs to play with, kind of similar to, say Outlaw Rogue, where that's kind of strict with the specializations that's good with. They're just those specializations. DPS Death Knight, broadly speaking, can kind of play with even some of the wizards. Obviously gets good value out of Chaos Brand too, if say Vengeance Demon Hunter was meta again, or Havoc Demon Hunter was meta again. But yeah, I think that Frost Decay is just a little bit more likely to be meta than Unholy. Unholy kind of has situations depending on the dungeon, whether it be, Floodgate, whether it be the first pull of Gambit, where it has these large pop-off moments. Now, it has gotten nerfed. Bursting Swords ended up getting nerfed a little bit on this patch. They are playing Rider of the Apocalypse, so they're less reliant on the Blood Beast RNG. I just don't think the overall DPS is, and the damage profile is as good as what we're seeing out of Frost Decay currently. So I think I have them separated by a half tier here, where I think the Frost Decay is more likely to occupy a larger share of the more broader meta compositions. So final 3 DPS. We have Havoc Demon Hunter, which I'm going to slam an A-. Kind of similar situation where it has been for a little bit. Eldrazi Reaver funnel damage is really, really good. Kind of similar. It's hard to play double funnel classes, whether it be Assassination plus Havoc or Havoc plus Arcane, which I think that hurts him a little bit. You only want realistically one funnel DPS in your composition. Otherwise, you're over-indexing into that damage profile type, and neither specialization that does good funnel damage is like super happy. Eldrazi Reaver is the preferred, it's the preferred hero talent. Some people are talking about Fellscarred. I think if you're playing Fellscarred, then that kind of makes Havoc Demon Hunter a lot less appealing in general. I think Havoc's really good though. I think it's less likely to occupy a large meta share, but in terms of third DPS options, I think that Havoc could slate into compositions and fit quite nicely depending on what's going on. They also bring Chaos Brand, which is a pretty valuable buff. Defensively, whenever things are less one-shotty and more sustained over time damage, the leech from having Demon Hunter is a lot better. Deflective Dance is obviously a lot better as well. So I'm put Havoc in A- for damage is totally fine. Rep Pally, I think this belongs in B. I think that there's a chance that Rep Pally gets buffed again as well. Their AoE damage is okay. I don't think they're like the best AoE DPS. I've seen some runs with Dazer where he's like doing really good AoE DPS, really good overalls. And it's kind of situation where Rep Pally is fine, not the best thing that you can be doing. I think it's a little bit worse than it was last season. Actually, a lot bit worse than it was last season. I think Rep Pally is really good last season. Maybe gets buffed though to the point where it ends up being somewhere in a similar state to where it was last season. Now we got the final two specializations with Shadow Priest and Windwalker Monk. And I think Shadow Priest, a lot of people would maybe be looking towards A. I think that Shadow Priest, in my opinion, is this A- tier. Shadow is very good. We haven't necessarily seen a season without Priest since Shadowlands Season 2. So it's kind of a situation where Priest is very popular just in Mythic Plus. Fortitude is obviously very solid. Mind Soothe, Mass Spell. All valuable pieces of utility, just generally speaking. Power Infusion also ends up affecting the Priest's damage by a little bit. That's basically just like 3 or 4% damage to one individual person. So kind of a simple math equation in terms of like how good Power Infusion is. I think that Priest is fine. I've seen actually a lot of Sprees do really garbage damage, but whenever you start looking at the absolute tip-top tier Sprees, like ZyBB from China, it looks like it's a pretty promising specialization. There's a chance that as the season goes on, we kind of see Shadow Priest begin to perform a little bit as expected or maybe a little bit better. Currently, I'm going to be putting this in A- because every single time I see it, I'm a little bit underwhelmed. Windwalker Monk, I think this goes in B tier. I don't think that Windwalker is that great. I think their overall DPS isn't fantastic. They ended up actually getting a nerf. I didn't think the spec was particularly good previously, but they did end up getting a little bit of a nerf where their tier set got nerfed and they ended up getting an 8% aura buff, which ended up being like net 2 or 3% damage loss. I think that this spec is like not great. There's large target count pulls in dungeons this season. Windwalker, of course, being target capped is not going to be benefiting from this. Also, if they're good in raid but bad in Mythic Plus, that's kind of one of the worst situations that you don't want to be in, especially as a specialization that cleaves almost all of their abilities. That's kind of a weird spot where you're like, because you know you're not going to get buffed. But yeah, that's basically how I feel about Windwalker Monk. Overall, though, that's basically how I feel about all the DPS in Mythic Plus. I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below. I kind of expect some stuff to kind of move up and down. Demo Warlock to kind of go down, Balanced Druid, Arms Warrior, Enhancement Shaman kind of go up, maybe Rep Paladin go up a little bit, just due to kind of the raid performance. If that happens, I'll end up reassessing kind of some of the stuff where we're kind of thinking. Let's kind of take a second to talk about some of the potential comps that we're going to be looking to see. So I think as it currently stands, there are 4 tanks that are slated to be pretty good. So we have a situation where Prot Paladin, Protection Warrior, Brewmaster Monk, and Vengeance Demon Hunter, wherever. Brewmaster Monk, yeah, Brewmaster Monk and Vengeance all seem to be very solid. For healers, it seems like it's Resto Druid as the top tier healer, then Resto Shaman and Disc Priest as kind of the second tier healers. But Resto Druid, like I said earlier, a little bit buggy, kind of unclear as to whether or not these bugs are going to end up getting addressed. How much is that going to affect Resto Druid's value? But those are kind of where we were looking at in terms of healing and tank profiles. I think a lot of people are maybe looking at some stuff that involves like, a Protection Warrior, a Resto Druid, and Assassination Rogue being the core of one of these more melee battle shout based compositions. I can't even Assassination Rogue. Like one of these more melee based battle shout compositions, maybe slamming in a DK here. And then we would need a Bloodlust. So I don't really know necessarily where we get the Bloodlust from. But yeah, something like that potentially. Making a lot of sense. I think that a lot of people are getting pretty high on Protection Paladin. I don't know if I'm necessarily that stonks on Pally, but a lot of people are looking at potentially, Pally Resto Druid, maybe Pally Disc Priest with like an Arcane Mage as like the core of this composition. Vengeance Demon Hunter, obviously. Vengeance Demon Hunter Disc, Arcane Mage, obviously very valuable as well. And then there's maybe some niche stuff like you could be looking to play with, let's say like a Brewmaster Monk and like a full fizz comp, like Brewmaster Monk Resto Shaman or Brewmaster Monk Resto Druid and that kind of. I think it's hard to say though. I think that we'll end up seeing what ends up happening as the season progresses, and I'm really interested in seeing what ends up happening overall. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, and I will see you guys later. Bye-bye.